Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and welcome to this webinar called How to Improve Your SAC Higg FEM Score. My name is Karin Ekberg. I am the manager of the consulting company Leadership and Sustainability. Before I started my own company, I worked several years at Adidas in the role of Head of Environmental Services, and before that at other companies managing sustainability at corporate level. Today we will introduce you to the SAC Higg FEM Facility Environmental Module. Then we will spend quite some time discussing how you can improve your Higg FEM score. And we will also have time for questions and discussion. And finally, we will make you an offer and present our team to you. And now let me introduce you to the Higg FEM. This slide gives you an overview of the Higg Index suite of tools. The suite of tools covers the brand and retail module, which means that they focus on the corporate level of brands and retailers, the facility modules focusing on manufacturing sites, either your own or your suppliers, and finally product modules focusing on the product module. And the Higg FEM itself, it's an online self-assessment tool for facilities. The FEM is divided into several sections: facility information, applicability, EMS, environmental management systems, energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, water, wastewater, air emissions, waste, and chemicals management. At the beginning, there are applicability questions, and based on the factory response to these questions, the actual sections questions are selected automatically. The questions are also sorted into 3 levels: level 1, 2, and 3, which means foundational, progressive, and aspirational. You begin at level 1, of course, and you need to respond to all questions at level 1 before you can move on to the levels 2 and 3 in each section. And SAC clearly wants to drive aspirational levels. In most cases, the scores are distributed with 25 at level 1, 50 at level 2, and 25 at level 3. But this can also depend on the applicability. There are annual reporting and verification cycles. The self-assessment is due by June 30th, and the verification can take place from January onwards until December 31st. The verification usually takes place on site. And there is also a how-to Higg document. That's a document that is publicly available. It gives guidance to factories, brands, and to verifiers about the FEM. And also one thing I wanted to mention, for those of you who are right now in the verification phase, please make sure that the export that you do, the Excel documents that you export from the Higg platform, that they are correct. And also then once the verification has been done and uploaded again to the platform, that the import also has taken place. And now I will talk about the experience we have gained during our verifications over the past months and how you can improve your score. We have verified in countries like El Salvador, UK, Romania, Turkey, India, Pakistan, Malaysia, China, Kenya, and Tunisia. So we have seen quite a lot of factories and, of course, also different countries. We have conducted around 25 verifications by now, ranging from 1 day to 5 days of duration, and we have conducted both general and chemical specialist verifications. You know the difference regarding the chemical specialist verification. If you have in your chemical section, if you move beyond level 1, then your responses at level 2 and 3 need to be verified by a chemical specialist verifier. And let me share some experience from these verifications. I will, of course, not mention any brand or factory or specific factory example that can be traced back to that factory. And as you know, there is a lot of content in the FEM, and I have picked a few examples for us. First, some general advice. when you complete the self-assessment, but also in preparing for the verification, please read the How to Hig guidance. It's a very long document, but it's also very helpful in terms of explaining what SAC means. They have technical explanations of the questions, but also what you need to upload, for example, regarding the questions. And then also respond to the questions comprehensively and document all responses. SAC actually requires documentation proof for nearly all questions. The SAC guidance on how to verify, the How to Hig guidance, is very strict regarding documentation, actually stricter than any ISO management system. Then be clear when setting targets and baselines. The baselines, you need to define them well. They should be stable, which means that you shouldn't change the baseline year every year, and depending on which area, you should try to, when you develop your strategy, you should try to set one baseline year and then set your targets year by year moving forward, comparing with that particular baseline year. For example, the year of 2017. And it's really important in order to have comparable results and also make sure that you know what you are working towards. So please do that in advance and not just when you basically mid-year perhaps, or in April or May, complete your self-assessment. This is really important. And then also, in order to prepare for the verification, ask for verifiers that are environmental specialists, persons who have an environmental background, who can understand your manufacturing processes, and also then, of course, the environmental aspects that are linked to your manufacturing processes. Also ask verifiers to send you an agenda in advance. Then please have your documents available and prepare to be able to explain why you have responded as you have. So when you are speaking to your verifier, be prepared to explain your thoughts and how you have developed your strategy, for example, or how you have developed your implementation plan. So that you just don't push forward documents and then expect the verifier to basically lead you through that document. It's your task to explain what your documents, what they contain, and how they are structured. It's also important to upload the documents in the right place. So often I have seen documents uploaded at one place only, for example, and then relating to several different questions coming later as well. It may be that sometimes you need to upload a document perhaps twice or even 3 times. But it's also important that you make sure that you are clear about which documents you want to use as a proof for a specific question. And I'm really aware that this sounds very trivial and simple, but believe me, I have seen many facilities lose points because they haven't spent enough time to understand the questions, respond correctly, and also document the responses. SAC has also issued a protocol for on-site verification. It gives you information about the verification process and, for example, how many days to calculate on-site, depending on the number of employees and the complexity of manufacturing. So there is guidance there from SAC. It's not a mandatory requirement to follow that guidance in detail, but it gives you as at the factory or at the brand, and of course us verifiers, also a hint on how much time we can spend or should spend. The verifiers, we have very clear guidance on how we should verify. In the How to Hig guidance document, it is outlined exactly what is needed for a full yes and for a partial yes, where that is applicable, and for a no. And then another thing I wanted to mention regarding following the How to Hig. Of course, I guess that many factories would like to achieve as many scores as possible, but it's not always possible to do that in the very first year. You may need some time to develop your programs accordingly. And also, of course, the tool, the FEM tool, is really there for continuous improvements to help you to improve in a continuous manner year by year. And it's also that sometimes it might not make sense to try to reach 100% everywhere. Perhaps you have areas that are really less relevant for you and where it doesn't make sense to invest a lot in order to reach perhaps a small improvement. On the other hand, you may have areas where with a smaller investment you could make a much better impact and a much better, more significant improvement. So that's really always up to the facility to decide. It's up to you to decide how your program should look like and with what pace you want to move forward as well. Now, the EMS, the environmental management system, you need to have a long-term environmental strategy reaching more than 3 years into the future. And this question is, of course, really important because it is the platform for all the programs that you have in every area. And I have seen many factories that don't have a long-term environmental strategy yet. So please work on that. This is also a question at level 1. So you do need to have that in order to move forward beyond level 1. You need to, and a good environmental strategy should address your facility's significant environmental impacts and compliance obligations as prioritized in your environmental impact assessment. It also needs to be supported by facility leadership. It needs to be communicated to all employees. And to ensure environmental objectives are carried out, your strategy should also include plans for achievement that detail, for example, what will be done, what resources will be required, who will be responsible, when it will be completed, and how results will be evaluated. And of course, this also sounds quite simple, but we do see very often that factories, they set a target to save 2% energy, let's say, next year, and then they forget about that target and don't really work to achieve it. And of course, the implementation plan helps you to lead you through that, lead you to that achievement. And also, if you have an environmental strategy that aligns with the requirements in ISO 14001, you can also answer yes then to this question. So if you already have an ISO 14001 certification or certificate, then you can respond yes to this question. Next topic is energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. In order to get full score here, you need to target larger than or more than 80% of your consumption when setting goals. And so if you have several energy sources, you need to cover probably several of them in order to reach that 80% coverage. You can decide to work with absolute or normalized targets. When setting targets related to energy consumption in manufacturing, it makes sense to normalize the targets. For example, to calculate energy consumption per production unit. This way, if your production goes down or up, you will not be punished or suddenly credited for something you couldn't influence. With normalized targets, you can make sure that you have comparable results even though production goes down or up. So for example, you have energy consumption per production unit. Now, let's say your production goes up 10% next year. Then you will, of course, need more energy as well. But if you have a target with the energy consumption per production unit, then basically this ratio will either stay the same if you have exactly the same conditions, or you may be able to save then if you have a savings program implemented. So let me read also from the How to Higg, because if you don't cover 80%, you will have a deduction of scores. So you will receive full points if you set targets for energy sources that make up 80% or more of your total energy use. You will receive partial points if you set targets for energy sources that make up 50 to 79% of your total energy use. And this is to reward you for aiming to improve your most significant sources of energy use, which will maximize then the environmental impact of your programs. So if you have a target, for example, covering less than 50%, you will actually receive 0 points here. So that's important to keep in mind. And now we have an interesting situation, or potential situation at least. Let's say you have reduced your greenhouse gas emissions by installing solar panels, and they contribute to more than 20% of your total energy consumption. So now when you wish to set the next year's target, how would you be able to set a target covering more than 80% of your total use? If you do that, then you also need to reduce the energy coming from the solar panels. But obviously you wouldn't like to do that. You would like to reduce the energy coming from conventional sources. So you should also not be punished for this. So you need to find some way to work around this. And we have asked SAC actually to consider this situation as well. And also don't forget to communicate the target to relevant employees. And I already spoke a bit about an implementation plan. But there is also a template available from SAC, which specifies the actions you need to take in order to reach, or where you can add the actions you need to take in order to reach your goal, who is responsible, etc. And so once you have received this presentation, you can click on the link here and find that implementation template. And now over to the water section. One question here is, which facility processes or operations use the most water? This is an important question, and for energy, you actually have a similar question. In order to respond to this question, you need to know the processes that use water, or energy in the case of energy, and you should have measured the quantities that go into each process using water. So you do need to know where the different water streams or where the water is going, into which flows and into which streams, and know also the quantities there. And here as well, you need to set a target that covers more than 80% of your consumption. And here we have a similar situation as for energy. So for example, if you are using rainwater and your consumption from rainwater is more than 20% of your total consumption, then you have an issue when defining a target that covers more than 80% of your total consumption. You don't want to reduce the consumption of rainwater, of course. You want to reduce the water coming from the municipal supply, for example. Wastewater. Wastewater treatment is quite complex. Depending on the applicability, it may be quite difficult for facilities to respond to all questions here. So please read the questions carefully and make sure also that the responses are accurate when it comes to the applicability questions. You may have either domestic wastewater and or industrial wastewater, but you may also have treatment off-site or on-site. So depending on your situation, you will respond to a set of different questions. And of course, also the scoring will be very different depending on which situation you have. We see that there are only very few other facilities who report against, for example, the SAC wastewater guidelines, which has defined 3 levels of wastewater qualities independent of the discharge, if into a river or into a municipal wastewater treatment plant. The levels in the SAC wastewater guidelines, they are quite aspirational. And so facilities who are reporting against these guidelines are also expected to be aspirational, to do well in terms of wastewater quality level, and are rewarded for that. During our verification, we have seen a few facilities who are recycling their process water which is very encouraging. But most of the facilities that recycle water, they do that. They use the recycled water for irrigation, for example. So obviously that water that is irrigated, that then goes out of the system. But we have also seen 1 or 2 factories that are actually recycling process water back into the process. Air emissions. Well, for those of you who have completed the self-assessment or the verification for the air emission sections, you may agree with me or you may not, but I think this is a really difficult section. There are applicability questions regarding production and other steps that produce air emissions. And the first question is, for example, select all sources of air emissions that are relevant to your facility's operations that are not regulated by a permit or for which your facility is not in compliance with its permit. So already the first question is a bit actually difficult to understand. There is also a mixture between indoor and outdoor concentration limits given in the How to Higg, but FEM actually covers both indoor and outdoor emissions. It's just that it hasn't been separated that clearly in all questions. One important question as well is covering the refrigerants and asks if any refrigerant has been refilled. If yes, then there must be a leak somewhere in the system and points will be deducted. There are also questions about control devices as well as questions about going beyond regulatory requirements. And from the factories that I have seen so far during the verification period of the past months, I haven't seen a factory that has actually been able to go beyond regulatory requirements. I'm sure there are such facilities out there, but I haven't seen one yet. Moving over to the waste section. In the waste section, which is actually quite long in comparison with some other sections, we have questions, for example, about storage. Especially important is, of course, the storage of hazardous waste. The same applies as for energy and water consumption, that the target needs to cover more than 80% of the total waste. This may mean that several waste categories need to have their specific targets. There are also questions related to disposal methods, aiming at improving also the disposal methods. So not only reducing the quantity of the waste in their different categories, but actually also improving the disposal methods. For example, being able to recycle waste or have a more environmentally friendly treatment of the waste. If you can, for example, move waste from landfills to incineration, that's seen as better. So this is also an area that you need to focus on in the waste section. Chemicals. The chemicals management section, it has been aligned with the SET-GHG, the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals program. So SAC and SET-GHG have worked together when developing the content of the chemicals management section. This section is very comprehensive. It has in total 23 questions, and it's also very complex. There are applicability questions, which means that, for example, garment factories that don't use a lot of chemicals will have much fewer questions to respond to than, for example, dye houses. And the chemical section is actually already at level 1, very challenging. The first question asks for a chemical inventory. This is, of course, a basic requirement, but my experience is that many factories that actually use quite a lot of different chemical formulations don't have a complete inventory. Some chemicals may be missing in the inventory, or the inventory doesn't contain all the information it should. Another question is related to SDS, safety data sheets. In my experience, many factories need to improve here. This is actually quite a basic requirement, but there is a lot of improvement potential out there. Either the SDS are not available at all, they are very old, perhaps they are 8 or 10 years old, or they are not available where chemicals are actually used. And of course, you need to have SDS or summary SDS available where chemicals are used to protect the workers who are using or who are handling the chemicals. Another question covers selecting and buying chemicals according to RSL, Restricted Substances List, and MRSL, Manufacturing Restricted Substances List. As mentioned, there are many more questions, but now I wish to focus on another question here. And I wish to discuss one question that asks factories to source chemicals from positive lists. This is a challenging question because it's not always clear-cut to differentiate between RSL and MRSL and positive lists. So for many factories already to comply with RSL, this is something you have been doing for many years, and now to comply with an MRSL is already quite challenging. But then moving beyond that and sourcing, buying chemicals from positive lists, that's quite a big step. And in order to be a bit confused sometimes, there are chemical suppliers who screen their chemicals against an MRSL and then promote the list of these chemicals as a positive list. But at least in my view, such a list is just a I'm not MRSL chemical list. So it's just a list that have, or a number of chemicals that have been screened against an MRSL, which is anyway something we are asking for. And in my view, this is not a positive list. We all don't want to believe that these pictures are true, but fact is they are. A few weeks ago, I visited a dye house. They supply to well-known brands in the upper price class. These brands are signatories to many of the common programs in our sector and often speak about their sustainability achievements. But I don't believe they have ever been to this factory. The workers handling chemicals were walking around in shorts and with the upper part of the body naked, and with beach sandals on their feet, on a very slippery shop floor and storage floor. One client RSL has never been implemented and the other could not be found. Instead, an unspecific list of chemicals restrictions had been downloaded from the internet and suppliers' declarations were accepted against a general list of purchase requirements. And by the way, this photo is not linked to that factory at all. This is just a photo taken from the internet. Let's make sure chemicals are handled safely and workers protected. And now I want to also speak about one of my favorite topics, and that's management systems. I'm a big fan of management systems. And of course, that's then also true for chemical management systems. So why do I like them? Well, they give you a structured and systematic way to approach any sustainability issue. This means that you can repeat and duplicate approaches and you can harmonize in your own factory or in your brand. On this chart, you can see some of the elements of chemical management system. You need commitment from your management and from your teams. You need to identify your chemicals, all of them. You need to assess your chemicals for risks. And then you also need to identify the chemicals and processes of concern. You need to set up your organizational structure, build awareness and train your teams. You need to set goals and you need to follow up on goals, etc. And of course, also move into the continuous improvement cycle. So that's really important to have a systematic approach to chemicals if you are using chemicals in your facility. And one slide also about factory health and safety. And I will not go into detail about the health and safety programs in factories, but I wish to give you just a few examples. First of all, we see a lot of focus on PPE, personal protective equipment, in the factories, and that's good and how it should be. However, just as a reminder, PPE should not be the first choice. This illustration shows the hierarchy of measures related to chemicals. The measure at the top, replaced with lower toxicity chemicals, is the first priority, and then we have process changes, isolation of chemicals, and only second last comes PPE, and last we have incident response. So PPE should be used only when no other measures are doable or have already been implemented. On another note regarding safety, you will ask yourself what this picture is doing here in this presentation. Well, I have asked myself many times what shoes like this are doing in a factory setting. We actually sometimes see factory staff and verifiers doing factory visits with shoes like this. But this is my firm opinion about this. These shoes are not made for factory visits. Anyone visiting the factory should use safety shoes. Or if you don't have safety shoes, but hopefully more robust shoes than the first pair I showed, stay within marked up areas and not visit, for example, wet processing or chemical storage areas. And this is really important. This is for your safety. And now I would like to open up for questions. And let me have a look if we have received any questions so far. Does anyone have a question you would like to ask? Here, a few people are raising your hands. Let me just see here. There we go. Yes. Okay, I have a question here regarding how the on-site verification is reported by the verifier, online or offline. Well, the response is actually both. We have, during the first months of the verification period, this summer and early autumn, we were reporting online. We were working in the actual VFEM, which is called the verification FEM, and that then we were working online. But more recently now, we are exporting all the results from the self-assessment into an Excel table, and then we are working in the Excel table offline. And once the verification is completed and the Excel table is complete, we upload, or SAC uploads the Excel table again. And in that Excel table, for example, we see all the responses, we see the current scores for every section. And when we, for example, during the verification would change a response, then that is also recorded in the Excel table, and the factory and the verifier can later make a comparison regarding the responses. And if the verifier makes a comment to a question, then this comment is then also inserted into a separate tab, which is called the performance improvement plan. And yes, another question is, can I have this presentation? Absolutely, you will be sent, you will receive this presentation as a PDF in a few days from now. And then we have another question. Let me see here. How do you count recycled water? If factory uses more recycled water, do you count them as saving? Yes, you can do that. So if you can recycle more, then you reduce the actual consumption of water from the, for example, the municipal piping. And let me see. There is one question I don't understand here, how waste target is larger than 80% of baseline year, or rather less or equal to 80%. If you would like to rephrase that question again, I will see if I can respond to it. Then another question. If the dye factory environment is not, if the, I guess the dyeing house, if the the dye house factory environment is not good, how to control? Well, if it is not good, then you need to build a system from scratch, so to say, and make sure that you have good control systems in place. And this is, of course, a larger project, and I would be happy to discuss this with you offline if you wish. But of course, it goes into what I showed about management systems. And also, for example, if you are working with the FEM, you can have a look at the questions, then perhaps especially in the chemical management section, and see what is needed there. We have a question also for a garment factory in general. What is the most common failure or low scoring area? Well, there are, of course, many areas, and it differs really from factory to factory, but I can say one question that is very often not completed really or responded to fully, that is the question about the 3-year plus strategy. That's a question where many factories actually fail. Another one is regarding setting the targets, covering the 80% or more. So several of the questions that I have mentioned here during the presentation are actually examples of areas where many facilities are failing or where they are weaker. And then, okay, let me see. We have a lot of questions here. There is a question about B Corp standard. So to how much of this work would be required to achieve a B Corp standard? And I'm sorry, that is a question I cannot respond to. I don't know the B Corp standard in detail. And then, do the hazardous and non-hazardous waste need to be kept in a separate store? Yes, they need to be kept separately, and especially hazardous waste also needs to be locked away, so to say, be kept in a store that is locked. Yes. We have also a question, how many verifiers are currently officially registered by SAC? And how many verifications have been done so far, approximately, among all certified verifiers? There is a website where all verifiers are listed, and I don't know the exact numbers. There may be 60 or 80 verifiers today, but I don't know the number actually. I also don't know how many verifications that have been done in total. We will need to ask SAC that question. Oh yeah, and then we have another question here. Where can we see the top scores for FEM? We wonder about the best scores that can be achieved in our sector. A good question, and this is something that SAC will certainly prepare for us once they have completed this year, for example. And I know that, for example, in May in Vancouver at the full member meeting, they were showing some statistics about the results. So we hope that we will be seeing that as well in a meeting coming up soon then. Okay, so those were some of the questions, and I think we are soon running out of time with the questions. So, and then there is also one question: do you have FEM tote training? FEM training? Yes, we have FEM training, and I will talk a bit about that right now. So let me continue then with the presentation. So I have some information about our offers before we close. And we offer verification in many countries. And as I explained at the beginning of this webinar, we have been verifying in several of the countries listed here. So if you are interested in verification, please get in touch. But we don't only offer verifications, we also offer trainings. And we have a few different trainings regarding the Higg FEM tool. We have a full day workshop face-to-face with me as a trainer. And you know, I'm a verifier, I'm a chemical specialist verifier, but I'm also trained with verification specialty. And that is a full day with, for example, with your team or with your company. And we offer that for the price of 3,500 euro. We have also decided to offer webinars. We have individual webinars, also with a group or a factory. But we have also decided that we will conduct 2 webinars, 2 times 2 hours in January, on January 15th and 17th. And we have also set the time already, 8:30 to 10:30. And if you're interested in joining, for example, this group webinar, please contact us or also use the booking tool that we have. And you can see you will receive the link with this presentation then in a few days. And the price for that group webinar is 250 euro per person. And there, of course, in this webinar, we couldn't go into too much detail, of course, but in the face-to-face training and in those webinars, we will go much more into detail about how to deal with the FEM. And we have come to our final slides. One slide here about our company, and here you see our team in the inner circle. But as mentioned, we work with freelancers and partners in most regions of the world as well. And now, before I say goodbye, I wish to inform you that there will be a survey with a few questions available after this webinar. We are really grateful for your input, so please take 2 minutes to respond to the survey. And thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.